You probably picture them with horned helmets. You picture wild, unwashed raiders leaping off langboats and burning everything in sight. That image is almost entirely wrong. And the real story of how the Vikings reshaped an entire continent is far stranger, far smarter, and far more terrifying than anything Hollywood gave you. It begins in Scandinavia, around 793 AD. A cluster of monasteries on the northeast coast of England had stood for over a century, quiet and untouched. Then one morning, ships appeared on the horizon. By sunset, the monastery of Lindisfarne was in ruins. The monks who survived described the attackers as a punishment from God. The rest of Europe took note.
But here is the question historians keep returning to. Why then? Why did the Norse peoples suddenly explode outward in the late 8th century after centuries of relative quiet? The answer, according to archaeologist Neil Price of Uppsala University, is not what most people expect. It was not simply greed or bloodlust. It was a population boom, a scarcity of farmable land, and a technological leap that most people have never heard of. The ship.
The Viking longship was arguably the most advanced watercraft the world had ever seen at that moment. It was shallow enough to glide across rivers, it was light enough to be carried over land between waterways, it could land directly on a beach without a harbor, and it could be rowed or sailed, which made it almost impossible to outrun. Historian Robert Ferguson, in his landmark work, The Vikings, A History, calls the longship not just a vessel, but a weapon of psychological warfare. When you heard the sound of oars on the water, you did not wait to see who was coming. You ran. And they came everywhere.
To the west, Norse raiders struck the coasts of England, Ireland, and Scotland with a precision that suggested careful reconnaissance, not random attacks. They hit during harvest season, when grain stores were full. They targeted monasteries, not out of religious hatred, but because monasteries held the most concentrated wealth in medieval Europe. Manuscripts, silver, gold, cattle. They knew exactly what they were doing. To the east, a group known as the Varangians pushed down the river systems of what is now Russia. They traded with the Byzantine Empire. They served as elite bodyguards to the Byzantine Emperor. Historian Thomas Noonan spent decades studying the silver coin hoards buried across Scandinavia and found that hundreds of thousands of Arabic dirhams had made their way back to Norse lands through these eastern trade routes. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were one of the most sophisticated mercantile networks of the medieval world. To the south and west, a group of Norse warriors and their descendants would eventually settle in northern France. They were given land by the Frankish king in 911 AD in a desperate attempt to stop the raids. Those settlers became known as the Normans of the North. And in 1066, their descendants crossed the English Channel and permanently altered the English language, the English legal system, and English culture in ways you still feel every single day. Think about the word beef. It comes from the Norman French bouffe. The word pork comes from pork. Law comes from the Norman loi. The very structure of English courtrooms, English land ownership, and English governance was rebuilt from the ground up by people whose great-great-grandparents had once been Viking raiders.
But let us go back to the raids themselves, because the popular image of Vikings as mindless destroyers misses something crucial. They were calculating. When they raided Paris in 845 AD, they did not sack the city and burn it down. They held it hostage. The Frankish king Charles the Bald paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. This practice, known as Danegeld, became a recurring feature of European politics for the next 2 centuries. You paid the Vikings not to attack you. England paid Danegeld repeatedly. It became, in effect, a Viking tax on an entire civilization.
Neil Price argues that what we are really seeing is not barbarism, but a highly rational extraction economy. The Norse understood leverage. They understood that the threat of destruction was often more valuable than destruction itself. You could only burn a monastery once, but you could threaten to burn it every year. And yet, destruction did come. Entire cities were razed. Dublin, which would later become the capital of Ireland, was founded as a Viking slave market. The slave trade was one of the most profitable engines of the Norse economy. Captives taken in raids were sold east to Byzantium and the Arab world. Archaeologist Soren Sindbäck has documented the slave trade routes that stretched from Ireland all the way to the Caspian Sea. One human being captured in a coastal raid might change hands 4 or 5 times before reaching their final destination thousands of miles away. This is the part of the Viking story that is hardest to sit with, and it is the part most often left out. But it is also what makes the Viking Age historically significant, rather than simply violent. What they built was not just a raiding culture, it was an intercontinental network. At its peak, the Norse world connected the British Isles to Scandinavia, to Russia, to Byzantium, to the Arab Caliphate, to Iceland, to Greenland, and ultimately to the shores of North America. Leif Erikson reached the continent you are living on roughly 5 centuries before Columbus. The Norse called it Vinland. They established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, confirmed by archaeologist Helge Ingstad in 1960. They did not stay. The indigenous peoples of North America were not willing to be displaced. The Norse retreated. But for a brief moment, the world was connected in a way it would not be again for centuries. How did it end? It did not end dramatically. It faded. The Norse societies converted to Christianity through the 10th and 11th centuries, which meant raiding monasteries became politically and religiously complicated. The kingdoms of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had adapted. They built fortified bridges across rivers to block longships. They constructed coastal watchtowers. They organized faster military responses. The element of surprise, which had been the Vikings' most powerful weapon, was gone. And the descendants of the raiders became the rulers. In England, the Danelaw had already carved out a permanent Norse-influenced region. In France, the Normans became the most powerful military force in Europe. In Russia, the Varangians became the ruling class of Kievan Rus, the medieval state whose cultural and political legacy stretches directly into the modern world. You carry this history, whether you know it or not. The days of the week in English are still named after Norse gods. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigg's Day. The legal concept of trial by jury, as it developed in medieval England, was partly shaped by Norse legal traditions brought by settlers. Words like window, knife, sky, anger, husband, and trust are Old Norse. When you say you are angry, you are speaking the language of a people who once made an entire continent afraid to look out at the sea.
The morning you woke up feeling anxious about the news, about the future, about the state of the world, and you looked out at the horizon wondering what was coming. Your ancestors did that too. They heard the sound of oars in the dark water, and they felt exactly what you feel now. That ancient alertness, that instinct that something is out there. The difference is, they were right, and the thing coming would change everything. Just as it did then. Just as it always does.